Okay, so back in March of 2021, one of the biggest things humans have ever put on the ocean, this massive container ship called the Ever Given, got stuck. Like really stuck, sideways in the Suez Canal. Now, you definitely saw the memes, but the real story of why it happened and how they got it out, well, it's this incredible mix of human drama, some billion-dollar physics, and a wild global rescue mission. Let's get into it. And yeah, that's putting it mildly. The Ever Given, a ship that's literally as long as the Empire State Building is tall, it didn't just cause some little delay, no. It completely severed one of the most vital arteries of the entire global economy. It created this huge ripple effect that touched pretty much every corner of the world. So the big question is, how did this even happen? At first, all the reports were pointing to one simple thing, a massive sandstorm with crazy powerful winds. But that explanation, it just never felt quite right. And as investigators started digging in, a much more complex picture started to emerge. To really get the pressure everyone was under, you just need to remember this one number, $10 billion. That's right. That was the estimated value of all the stuff. We're talking everything from oil to iPhones that was just piling up, stuck in a traffic jam at the canal every single day. With every hour that the Ever Given was stuck, the financial stakes just got higher and higher, creating this immense pressure to solve the problem and solve it fast. And this is where you can see the two stories side by side. On the left, you've got the simple story we all heard at first. The ship was basically a giant sail that got caught by the wind. Easy, right? But on the right, that's the real truth. And it came from the ship's black box, its voyage data recorder, and it captured the audio from the bridge. A story of arguments, of confusion, and ultimately, a huge human element. And this is where the story gets really compelling. We're zooming in from this massive global trade crisis to a very human drama, all unfolding in real time and probably the most high-stakes environment you can imagine, the bridge of a billion-dollar ship. So the power dynamic up on the bridge was just incredibly tense. You've got the captain, who's the master of a ship, right? But in the Suez Canal, he has to hand over some control to local pilots who know the waterway. Now, add in a language barrier between English and Arabic, plus the kind of mixed reputation of some of the Suez pilots, and you've got a perfect recipe for disaster. And that tension, it completely boiled over. According to the data recorder, the two pilots were just shouting at each other, arguing about the ship's speed and the weather. And when the captain tried to step in, one of the pilots actually threatened to leave his post. It was total chaos, at the absolute worst possible moment. And right in the middle of all that shouting and confusion came the critical command, speed up to 13 knots. Now, the pilot's thinking was that more speed would give him more steering control. And, in the open ocean, that might be true. But here, in the narrow, tight confines of the Suez Canal, it was the worst possible thing they could have done. That one single command triggered this incredibly powerful force of physics that made the crash pretty much inevitable. It's a phenomenon that sailors know all about, but it's one that caught the crew of the Ever Given completely off guard. And it all comes down to this, Bernoulli's principle. You might remember this from high school science class. The basic idea is that when a fluid, like water, is forced to move faster, its pressure drops. And that simple rule is exactly what sealed the ship's fate. So here's exactly what went down. That full-ahead command forced water to rush through that tiny gap between the ship's hull and the canal bank. This created a low-pressure zone, and the much higher pressure on the other side of the bow acted like a giant vacuum cleaner, just sucking the front of the ship right into the shore. The crew was fighting the rudder, trying to steer away, but they weren't just fighting the ship. They were fighting physics, and physics won. So the ship was now totally wedged, blocking about 12% of all global trade. And the question became, how on earth do you move a 200,000-ton ship that's stuck in a canal? Well, the answer was going to require a combination of brute force, some really clever engineering, and a little bit of help from the moon. We all saw this photo, right? This one little excavator. It became a global meme overnight. It was the perfect symbol for being faced with a hopelessly overwhelming task. And yeah, it looked ridiculous. But that digging was actually the critical first step in a much bigger, much more complicated operation. The rescue took 6 super intense days. It started with these small tugboats that just couldn't budget. Then they moved on to dredging. A world-class salvage team from the Netherlands was flown in, and eventually these massive, powerful tugs arrived to help. But the real game changer, that was nature.
The whole operation was timed to line up perfectly with a supermoon high tide, which would give them the extra lift they desperately needed for that final push.
So the final strategy had 3 key parts. First, you had the brute force of over a dozen tugs pulling like crazy. Second, all that dredging, digging out the buried bow. And third, a really clever use of physics. They actually pumped ballast water into the back of this ship to create a lever effect, helping to lift the bow just enough to sync up with that peak high tide.
And then, at 3 p.m. on March 29th, it worked. The ship broke free. The response was just immediate joy. Every single ship waiting in the canal sounded its horn, the sound of immense relief that just echoed for miles, signaling that the global traffic jam was finally over.
But freeing the ship, that wasn't the end of the story. Not by a long shot. The whole incident served as this dramatic, week-long lesson in just how fragile the systems that power our modern world really are. Just look at this number, 12%. 12% of all global trade passes through this one narrow strip of water. Pretty much everything we depend on, from the gas in our cars to the clothes we're wearing, has a good chance of having passed through this exact spot. And for 1 week, the world got a rude reminder of how much we depend on this single choke point. So, once the Ever Given was floating again, it was towed to a nearby lake and, well, it was just held there. The rescue mission very quickly turned into a tense legal standoff over who's going to pay for this billion-dollar mess. The Suez Canal Authority, which is run by the Egyptian government, initially demanded over $900 million in compensation. They wanted money for the rescue and for, reputational damages. The ship's owners thought that was just an absurd figure. So after months of negotiating, the demand was lowered, and a secret settlement was eventually reached to finally let the ship and all its cargo go. What's so amazing about this whole story is that the shipping industry is designed to be invisible. Ports have moved away from our city centers, and these giant ships just quietly move all the goods that fuel our lives completely out of sight and out of mind. But for 6 days, this invisible industry was suddenly dramatically the center of the entire world's attention. It really revealed the incredible fragility of a system that we all just take for granted. It took just one ship, one heated argument, and one little misunderstanding of high school physics to bring global trade to a screeching halt. And it leaves us with a really important question. Our world runs on all these invisible systems, so what happens the next time we're forced to see one of them break?